That's a very good question. I think that rape obviously is as old as war and has happened throughout history. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore it now. It means that we're in the 21st century and we should be thinking about it as something that is a war crime and that needs to be addressed as such. I'm afraid that that's not true. I mean, there's all sorts of slavery going on around the world. There's child slavery and there is a lot of sexual slavery. And we have seen with the Yazidis, for example, who were captured by Islamic State fighters in 2014 and taken in thousands and traded one to another. And basically as if they were animals or possessions, and that is still happening. It's when you talk to women who've been through these things, almost all the women that I met in so many different countries, and I spoke to women in 12 countries on 5 different continents at length, apart from other women that I've spoken to elsewhere. Almost all of them told me that they would rather have died than have gone through what happened to them. And that's why it's so important that this issue is addressed and not sort of treated as some kind of side issue in war that doesn't matter, that doesn't have the same weight as killings and torture, and which is what, through history has happened when you look at the Nuremberg trials or previous international tribunals before Rwanda. These were regarded as things that didn't really matter. The reason that I became interested in this, I think, was when I started out, which was more than 30 years ago, as a war correspondent. There were not many female war correspondents, and I was always much more interested in what happened to women in war. I'm not very interested in the actual fighting and the bang-bang. I don't like that. I'm really interested in how people live their lives during war and how they protect and feed the children and educate them and protect the elderly. And usually it's women that are doing that. So my focus has always been much more on talking to them and seeing them really as sort of heroes of war, even though we don't have statues pretty much anywhere for women in war. The statues are all for fighters. But because of that interest and the fact that I spoke so much to women, meant that I also was hearing the dark side of what happened to women in war, which is sexual violence and brutality, and also just seeing how it seems to be happening on a greater scale and in more and more countries. And I found that very difficult to understand why surely we should be making efforts to reduce this, not that it should be happening more. I think the military histories have tended to be written by men, and they haven't really spoken to women so much. So that's one of the reasons these stories haven't been told. Also, these stories are difficult to tell, and one of the tragic things about this is that the women that this happened to often feel shame, that they feel, they're the victim, but it's a crime where they feel that they're the ones that did something wrong. Often in their societies, they're ostracized, humiliated, cast out from where they live. And so they haven't come forward with the stories, or where they have, people haven't wanted to hear. A good example of that is in the Second World War during the liberation of Berlin, when the Russian soldiers raped maybe as many as 2 million women in Germany, and yet This happened to so many people, but the stories were not told. And a woman that did write an anonymous account called A Woman in Berlin, that book was regarded as something shameful not to be, and it was taken out of publication. It's only very recently that it's now been republished and that people have started talking. When my book came out in Germany, a lot of people contacted me and said, this happened to my aunt, or this happened to my relation, and they never spoke about it. It was really considered taboo. So that needs to end. The first thing that we need to do to try and change this situation is to actually stop the shame and say, no, these women, they've done nothing wrong. They're the victims, and they're actually the heroes, the fact that they've come forward to speak. And so we should be supporting them, not trying to hide what's happened. I think that we need to do something about it. Unfortunately, rape is a difficult crime to get conviction for, even in our societies. In the UK, where I come from, the conviction rates are less than 3%. In Spain, you also have a lot of issues, although you've brought in a very enlightened law recently, which I think is very important. But so if it's difficult in societies where women have education, access to resources, lawyers, and they still can't get justice, imagine in places where the women don't have any of those things, and where the perpetrators are the very people that are supposed to be the ones protecting them, whether it's in their police or army or local militias who are intimidating them. So the idea of them being able to come forward and get justice is just really impossible. So they need help. This is not going to change until there is international leadership on this issue. The fact is, every country in the United Nations voted a resolution 20 years ago that acknowledged this as a war crime and said that we must make efforts to reduce this. And yet, in that time, almost nothing has been done. Only one person has been convicted by the International Criminal Court for this in 20 years. And it's just not good enough, and it won't change until there's international leadership on this issue. So I just came back from Kabul last week, and it was extremely odd going to Kabul, which is a city I know very well. I've been going to for more than 30 years, and seeing Taliban everywhere and women almost nowhere to be seen, and very sad. And most of the people I know have fled the country or are in hiding and are moving to different safe houses every couple of days because they're so scared at what the Taliban will do. The Taliban have said that they're different to when they ruled from 96 to 2001. They're obviously very much engaged in a PR offensive at the moment because they need international aid and they want recognition. But the words are not necessarily being matched by their deeds, because the fact is, the government that they announced is a government with no women, that has no women's ministry, but has a ministry of what we regard, or generally known as the morality police, the Ministry for the Prevention of Vice and Protection of Virtue. There has been hanging, there's been target killings, and women have been told not to work. Women have been told not to go to Kabul University. And girls at the moment are allowed to go to primary school, which is different to when the Taliban were in power before, but it's the only country in the world where girls can't go to secondary school at the moment. So the actual signs, I'm afraid, are not very good. So, I mean, as I said earlier, rape has happened in war throughout, and often as a way to reward soldiers or a way to encourage soldiers to fight, or just because of the general breakdown in law and order during war and sort of them people, anything goes kind of situation. And so what I wrote about in my book was a bit different to that. I was writing about cases where rape was actually used as a weapon of war in order to humiliate an enemy. And that happened during the Spanish Civil War, when Franco's forces, the Phalangists, the Moroccan army, were used to humiliate women. Women had their heads shaved, were branded, were raped, were forced to drink castor oil so that it would act as a laxative, so they would spoil themselves. And this was very much used as a deliberate weapon. You had General actually speaking on the radio, encouraging people to do this. And the sad thing is, I mean, it's an effective weapon, because if you really want to terrorize and humiliate your opposition by raping all the women, it works, because it makes the men feel that they can't protect their women, and it terrorizes the society. And that's unfortunately why it's still being used so much. And I said earlier about the fact that, you know, we haven't had justice for it, even though it's been going on for a long time. And that is because there has been this tendency not to talk about what happened, to cover it up, to only talk about other issues, the killings and the torture. So there's many wars and many military dictatorships. We know about a lot about what happens in terms of torture and killings, but we haven't heard the stories of what really happened to the women. And it's only really now it seems that people are starting to come forward and talk about it and actually get justice in some cases.